Welcome to the Alia Graphic Podcast, and today we've got an awesome chat with an Australian manga creator. I'm Marissa, and I'm an avid reader of all things manga and webtoons, so I am really excited about this chat. But before we get started, as a national group based across the land we call Australia, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I would specifically like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the custodians of the land from where I'm speaking and where I work and live. I pay respect to the elders, past and present, of all First Nations people across the land and thank them for their rich storytelling traditions and art. We need truth-telling and we need treaties. And now we need to talk to our special guest. So today our special guest is Queenie Chan, who has written a variety of fantastic graphic novels. Today, the focus is on the series The Dreaming, which is getting a new edition soon. So, hello, Queenie.
Hello, Marissa. Good to see you.
You've been making manga for a long time. For those who don't know you, could you introduce yourself and the comics you've been making?
Sure. As Marissa's already introduced me a little bit, my name's Queenie Chan. I'm a manga style comic book artist. So my first published work was a series called The Dreaming, which is, as Marissa said, is republished. It was originally published in 2005, and it's an Australian theme story about kind of picnic at Hanging Rock. It's a mystery thriller, kind of supernatural series, and it's got 3 volumes, and volume 1 is already out. And volume 2 is just coming next month, I think. No, hang on. Volume 1 is already out. Volume 2 and 3 is coming out, I think, in May, June, July. Yep, so they're coming out very quickly because they've already been done. And this is a revised edition, so there are some elements that are different from the original version. Yes, and because we're looking to do a side story and a sequel to it, that's the story set in
cool.
Australia, so so it's going to be more Australian themed stories, so that's great. So apart from The Dreaming, I've done some illustration work with some well-known authors, and Dean Koontz being one of them. So I grew up reading his work, so it was very thrilling to illustrate some of his works based on his series called Odd Thomas, which is his best-selling series, and that's aimed at a younger middle grade audience. And then I worked with an Australian author called Queenie Chan, and she did a series called White Tiger, which is kind of a Chinese-themed fantasy that is based in Hong Kong, because she's actually lived in Hong Kong, and all that. So that was an interesting experience because I did a mix of prose and comics for that. Having worked with Dean Koontz, I know that prose authors can be very sensitive when their prose gets altered in any way, and unfortunately, that's the adaptation process. So in trying to make it a bit more easier for them to deal with, I just turned half of what she wrote into comics and then kind of spliced it in with the rest of her prose. And so that's an interesting process. After that, I did some of my own work. I did a fairy tale inspired adventure series called Fabled Kingdom, which is also 3 volumes. And since then, I did a series of non-fiction graphic novels about famous historical queens. So they're biographies, and they're reasonably short, kind of aimed at a younger audience. And they're pretty well researched as well, because I don't believe in talking down to kids. If a kid's interested, I think that they should be, as educated as well as, using the same resources as adults are. So that series has been distributed by Scholastic and Lamont, so you could get it through various library suppliers and things like that. Yep. So with The Dreaming having come back from Tokyo Pop, the rights, is that I am currently planning on the side story and the sequel of that story.
All right, so time travel. Let's go back in time. What comics or manga or graphic novels did you read as a child? And which ones were your favorites?
Well, I grew up in Hong Kong and came to Australia when I was 6 years old. So back at the time in Hong Kong at the time, there was a number of pirated manga that was quite popular. And I was too young to understand anything, of course. But back in Hong Kong then, they had these little news agencies on street corners when these pirated manga would be sold. And my mum, I guess my parents saw, kids' cartoony stuff, and just bought some for me. And I used to be really fascinated by the art and the drawings. And so one of my favorite ones was, which is popular all over Southeast Asia, is Doraemon. So that's a very popular Japanese manga about this magical robot from the future, and they come back to help a poor little boy called Nobita, who is a pretty bullied kid with, who's kind-hearted, but a very good representation of a lazy kind of little boy who really needs the help. And it's such a great kid story because it does a lot of it teaches you a lot about morality, I guess, but in a way that is not preachy. And so I grew up watching, reading that, and also some of Rumiko Takahashi's work. So back when she was doing her first work called Urusei Yatsura, later on she did Inuyasha, and so she's best known for that amongst the younger cohorts. But that was when I was first exposed to her work. And I guess I was especially attracted to her work because she's a female artist, and you could always tell when someone has that kind of feminine touch when it comes to the artwork. So she was one of my favorites, even though I didn't understand a thing that was going on in her stories because she wrote for a teen audience. And lastly, there was also Dragon Ball. So that was a very popular series in Hong Kong at the time. And so I got into it. Dragon Ball being a martial arts kind of adventure story that is based a lot of Jackie Chan movies and, Kung Fu movies. And I loved a lot of that as a child because obviously from Hong Kong, there was a lot of movies like that being produced at the time. So that was part of what I was already familiar with. And that these are some of the stuff that I grew up with and had a huge influence on me when I was growing up.
The library angle to it. You've been very involved and very interested in getting Australian graphic novels into libraries, which is, of course, a mission that we at Alia Graphic share. Would you like to talk about that, Annie, and why it's important for you and for the Australian comic reading community?
Of course. Originally, when I came over to Australia and I kind of got, that was many years ago. When I started drawing manga and kind of got involved a bit with the local comics community. There's a huge gap between them and publishers at the time. Because let's face it, comics have been around for a very long time, but as things that you can get into bookstores, into libraries, it's kind of a relatively new phenomenon. Like Tokyo Pop, the company that I work for, had a hand in getting manga into bookstores. So regardless of what people say about them, they do play a very important role in the kind of the history of taking, well, not just manga, but kind of taking comics, putting it into a book form, putting an ISBN on it and getting it onto bookshelves, whether in bookstores or libraries. That didn't really exist not because there was no market for comics, but because the way that it was published was not conducive to getting it into libraries. It was published as serials, and libraries deal with books, and same with bookstores. So there was that issue. And so the idea of collecting it into a collected volume and then selling it to people who read books, that's something that's only in the West anyway. That's something that popped up in the past, 10 or 20 years. And even then I had to deal with, up until 5 years ago, I had to deal with, booksellers who thinks it's a fad. And we can conclusively say now that it's not a fad, and this category is here to stay. And so that's great. A lot of people are clearly comics. Kids are reading comics. Adults are reading comics. It's a lot more common these days than it used to be. And the way that people perceive comics has also changed. It used to be something that is kind of trash. Now people acknowledge that it is just a medium like any other. So the thing about being an Australian is that we are constantly being flooded by work from overseas. And that's a problem that all, I think, smaller countries have. This is not a big country. It's got a population of 25 to 30 million at most, and that's not, going to increase anytime soon. And it's just the nature of living in a smaller country. And because it's a smaller country, it's always hard to have local publishers that can afford to get a graphic novel going. And if they do, they have to keep in mind of international audiences and the sort of things that you got to be careful in that if you put too much Australian elements into it, then people would balk. International audiences would balk at that and like, oh, I don't think it's for us, that kind of attitude. So for Australian creators, it's a fine balancing act between putting Australian cultural elements into it and making sure that you can still appeal to an international audience. So as a writer, I do want to express my, the culture of my own country, Australia. And for that reason, I feel it's very important for readers, the next generation of readers, adults as well, to see their own culture and aspects of their own country reflected back at them when they read things, particularly with younger creators who would be going on to create the next generation of comics. Because there is an attitude of monkey see, monkey do. If you read something from America, you read something from Japan. For younger kids, it's normal to try and imitate what you see. And but if that's all they see, then you're not really drawing from life or your experience of being a person who lives in a particular country. And so I feel it's very important to get Australian works into libraries, into schools, into bookstores, to let people know that a medium, whatever medium it is, in comics in this case, is meant to reflect life, and your experience of a particular life. And that's, a sizable chunk of the value comes from that. And it's not just entertainment, though, of course, it can just be, that's fine. But we want more diverse voices, and this is one way that you can get more diverse voices out there. And it has been interesting with The Dreaming as well, because it is a very Australian story. It's kind of Picnic at Hanging Rock. It has several elements in it that Americans apparently didn't quite understand, because the series was first published in America, and the story is about a haunted school set in the Australian bush. A pair of twin sisters go to this school, and they discover that schoolgirls have been vanishing there. So as I said, it's a kind of a story that has some kind of Australian mythos, and it kind of plays right into the fear of the bush with Australians. And it was interesting when it was first published in America, people apparently there could not tell the difference between the bush and the outback. So in Australia, there is no way that people would know the difference between the bush and the outback. It is a completely different thing. But I've heard people describe The Dreaming as a haunted school story set in the Australian outback. And it's like, no, it's not. It's set in the bush. But that's fine. I don't expect people from foreign countries to understand the difference. But here is an example of what I mean, is that sometimes you could do things that make sense to you as an Australian and have it play completely different overseas, because they just don't have the same cultural context. Whereas I've never met an Australian who didn't understand what I was talking about. So these are some of the things that can happen, and there's great value in creating content from your own country, and that has those kind of cultural elements.
Yeah, and I can say from the reader's perspective, it is nice to have all kinds of elements of daily life and mythos and so forth in a graphic novel format. When I was living in Japan, I picked up a lot of things about the culture that were kind of taken for granted by everyone else around me, that I didn't even know I might need to ask about and so forth. It showed up in manga and graphic novels I was reading and anime I was watching. And that helped me figure out some of the cultural aspects of Japan that would have completely thrown me for a loop otherwise. And yeah, I kind of feel like that happens for situations and culture things here as well. So thank you for helping this poor, currently American person learn that there is a difference between the bush and the outback, among other things.
Yeah.
Because we need more Australian representation than Crocodile Dundee and Steve Irwin.
That's the interesting thing about these two characters. They're great, like very entertaining, but they've always been kind of mid-Atlantic in their appeal. And I only found out about Steve Irwin from a Canadian, actually. And it's like a lot of Australians haven't heard of him until he became famous in Australia. And they represent a particular kind of archetype, I guess, that is still Australian, but the way that they package themselves is done to appeal to a foreign audience. And you see that happening with certain kind of Australian cultural exports. Like, for example, the latest one is Bluey. Bluey and his family. And I don't know if you've kind of seen the Bluey cartoons, but watching them in Australia is like, oh, that's so Australian. And then you hear stories about how the American version, which is quite popular, it's a popular show in America, they had to change this episode and people got mad. And it's like, well, why are you doing this? And it's like, you have to change certain elements because sometimes Americans just don't get it. They have no idea what you're talking about. And so I wasn't bothered by that. I've had some interesting stories about The Dreaming regarding how Americans reacted to some of the characters in it, which we could talk about later on. But there is, like, despite being English-speaking countries, and that you'll think have a lot more in common, is that the truth is that isn't true. You'll be surprised at how the cultural differences can crop up, and it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, which is why while people in Australia are pretty familiar with American comics and what they talk about, it is different, and that as an Australian. That certain things don't happen the way there as they do here.
For those who may not have heard of the series The Dreaming, could you briefly describe what the book is like?
Okay, so The Dreaming is a three-book series. Hold it up again. This is the first volume, so it's about 180 to 190 pages each. And so it's a three-book series. It just got volume two in print, so that's the
Nice.
cover for volume two. And
Very
these
nice.
are the revised editions, and so they've got different covers and additional content at the back. And I've also changed some aspects of the story, which I'll talk about
Okay.
on. These are minor changes,
Yeah.
but they are significant in that it kind of allows the story to continue in a
Mm-hmm.
new form later on. So the
Yeah.
story is about a pair of twin sisters called Jeannie and Amber, and they're Eurasian, actually. You can't really tell unless you read the second volume. They kind of talk a little bit about their background. Who, their parents have gotten divorced, and so they've been sent to a boarding school in the Australian bush. And it's a pretty large boarding school and has a very kind of classic Victorian look to it. And this is something that you have to read the story to get across. And they discover at the school that the vice principal really does not want twin sisters there, and that students, for as long as the school has been around, which is quite long, has been vanishing from the school. And they just walk off into the bush and never seen again. So this is a problem that the school has, but not many people talk about it. There are ways that you could suppress those kinds of stories. Yep. So after they started staying at the schools, they started to get these strange dreams. That's about the probably they think the history of the school, and they think it has something to do with the missing girls. So it is a supernatural mystery thriller where they are trying to figure out the mystery of the dreaming, and there are various plot twists and turns. And obviously, I can't tell you, can't say
Yes, yes,
here.
yes.
Yeah, it's
Yep, no
I
major
like mystery
spoilers.
stories. Yeah, I like mystery stories. It does have a kind of downbeat ending, I would say, but then the story continues because in the sequel the girls come back, and there are additional characters with that. So the story does continue. So with the original, it kind of ended in volume three, which is why it had some of these elements that were removed later on.
Okay.
Now, so right now, I would say that the story is more Lovecraftian. Don't know if you're familiar with the works of H.P. Lovecraft. My inspirations were
Ooh,
largely Western, actually, even though my
Eldritch horrors.
yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about my inspiration and all
Okay.
that with Lovecraft. And so the thing about what I do with the dreaming is that unlike a lot of other manga style comic authors, I don't really take inspiration from Japan, apart from the storytelling and the paneling and the character design. So if you look at my artwork, it's very superficially manga, and that's just what it looks like. But in terms of inspiration, all my inspirations were Western, and the work of H.P. Lovecraft is one of them. So macabre fiction, like the work of Edgar Allan Poe, Lovecraft was directly inspired by him. English ghostwriters like M.R. James, I think he's English, I'm not entirely sure. Um, those kinds of, writers from that era, that kind of classic 1930s, 40s kind of, I would say, pulp era of writing horror, that they were a big influence on me. I enjoy those kind of stories because it was a strange period in English literature in that people were moving away from the kind of gothic stories that the gothic thing is very feminine. We know that we have things like that. Yeah, I think Wuthering
Wuthering
Heights.
Heights.
Yeah, that is super gothic, and Radcliffe was super popular, and so the gothic literature is kind of morphed into something a little bit different. Like there were science fiction elements kind of merging
Hmm.
together with gothic literature, and that was what produced weird fiction, and which is a kind of subcategory of horror. And Lovecraft was specifically an author who identified as a weird fiction author. Yeah, so maybe you could put a weird fiction tag on the dreaming because of some of its Lovecraftian influences. And yeah, so the interesting thing about Japanese manga is that they are a lot of the more macabre aspects of Japanese manga, the horror, is very much inspired by Edgar Allan Poe. So H.P. Lovecraft was also inspired by Poe. So you could say that both in manga and outside of it, Poe was a massive, massive influence on many, many people and cultures. Yeah. So if you're into horror stories, Poe wrote a particular kind of horror, and as did Lovecraft, the kind of a cosmic horror, in that the threat often comes from what they call the unknown, the uncanny. So not just ghosts and zombies and I don't know, vampires and blood and gore and gut spilling every day. It's not that kind of
Hmm.
horror. It's a more kind of a existential horror that is based on people encountering the unknown and the paranormal and not really knowing how to deal with it. Yeah, so it's that kind of an uncanny kind of horror.
What was it like publishing The Dreaming so many years ago with Tokyo Pop?
And that was interesting because as as you say, it's many years ago, and the attitude towards manga at the time was very different. That was back in let's see, around 2002, 3, 4, and manga was a new thing in American bookstores. It was nothing like traditional
Yeah.
American comics. There was a fair amount of hostility from people who read traditional American comics because they didn't understand what it was. And this is something that's forgotten about in the early days of Western manga in bookstores, is that a lot of the works that the Tokyo Pop published was targeted at teen girls, like a completely neglected segment of the American comics industry. And so,
Hmm.
because it was targeted at young women, let's face it, anything that appeals to women in our cultural landscape is usually looked down upon. It is considered a less prestigious thing. People make fun of it, particularly for stuff for teen girls. And so there was an awful lot of that going on back in those days. And
Yeah.
as a manga artist who was actually targeting that audience, it was interesting. We, as a group, Tokyo Pop at the time, put out a notice online asking for international manga authors to submit original works to them. And the only reason why I kind of encountered that was because I was just surfing on the internet looking for a manga, and I just stumbled across their notice, and that's when I just found out that they were open to submissions. And luckily, I got my foot in early because they did start something big in America. They were flooded with submissions, but because I came across that notice, I was able to get a submission early in, and they turned out all my submissions. Yeah, yeah, that was a real tragedy because when I was submitting to Tokyo Pop, because unlike a lot of other Tokyo Pop authors at the time who went in through the same program, they were okayed on their first go. I had to be rejected several times, which is a good learning experience. But in the end, they just said, "Look, you obviously can draw, and write, and tell a story. Can you tell us get us a story about a haunted school that's targeted at teenage girls?"
Huh.
And yeah, and I had a week to come up with that story. And at the
Oh,
time,
wow.
I was like, holy heck, because that was nothing like some of the other stuff that I submitted. And
Hmm.
so I was like, okay, interesting challenge. So that I came up with the dreaming because I thought I'm Australian, they're American. I think there are, if you're talking about fear, about haunted schools, my problem with haunted schools in Japan is that they're always set in urban areas, which is
Yep.
not scary. It is because I think I associate horror with isolation. No, and
Hmm.
haunted schools with isolation because come on, if you're haunted school, why are you staying? Get the heck out of there. Yeah,
Yeah.
so you have to kind of engineer a situation where people cannot leave the
Well, I mean,
haunted
my
building.
guess would be these haunted schools in the downtown in Japan, it's because the students are thinking, I put so much effort into the entrance exam for this high school. I don't want to have to do that again for another school. I can live with a few ghosts as long as they're not, stealing
Mhm.
my homework.
Yeah, that's got to be a comedy. I think there is probably manga like that in Japan, but in Japan, the haunted schools are urban, typically because there are a lot of urban legends that is set in schools about
Hmm.
weird school happenings, and a lot of Japanese manga refer to that. In the West, there isn't really much of anything, really. Haunted schools obviously exist, but not really in the same way, and so it's unusual to be given that kind of genre opening. Is like write me a haunted school story, but I thought for a haunted school to be believable, you have to be remote, you have to be far away from civilization, you have to be in a situation where people can't get away. And so it kind of plays into that fear of isolation. And I think it works really well with Australia and what Australians fear about their own country. Like people go missing in the bush all the time in Australia. This is not news. Um, it actually happened to a classmate of mine. Dreaming was also partly inspired by that. It was a few years after I heard of her disappearance in Tasmania when she was going camping. They found her gear, not her. Nobody to this day. I don't think she's ever been found. And so this is
Oh,
something
wow.
that yeah happens a fair amount. And this is an experienced hiker. So this is what happened to her, and she's not the only one. And so the idea of a remote building somewhere in the Australian bush where people disappear. It's not as far-fetched as you might think. And then there's Picnic at Hang Rock, a very well-known kind of Australian story that absolutely plays into that fear and has been around for a very long time. So people kind of here at least think of it in a certain way. I don't really know how Americans think about it because it's not really a thing in America. Like remote boarding schools, like what? They exist, but people have a very different kind of feeling towards these kind of stuff. So the dreaming came about because I was given that genre to work with, and so I was able to pitch something in a very short amount of time. Like I think it was 1 week, and they accepted it. And it's astonishing how things worked out as well as it did, like with the story that everything came together at the end, given how it kind of happened, this story. And it was quite a challenge, like making it happen. But it kind of, I kind of relished it as a writer. I guess I enjoy these kind of challenges. How do I make something interesting? As with most creators, I'm pretty harsh on myself. And I always enjoy these kinds of exercises because I think it makes you a better writer. Being challenged, being given limitations that you have to work around. And so despite, it not being ideal, is that I pitched something and it got rejected, but I'm glad I had that experience and I ended up quite liking, the dreaming and this world that I kind of created for it.
I can say, as someone that was part of your target demographic at the time, I am sad that I didn't hear about it. I was starting to read manga somewhere around maybe a couple years after you published that.
Mm-hmm.
And I had not caught on to the idea that a lot of it was marketed towards a female audience versus a male audience, but that makes so much sense now.
Yeah, and so they kind of Tokyo Pop, like regardless of what people say about them, they did do something very important for women, as comic readers, because that was a market that was completely ignored in the West. It's not prestigious. People look down on it. And Tokyo Pop said, whatever, there's money. So they just brought all this shoujo stuff, like the stuff for teen girls over. And it kind of helped me too. To be honest, I read a lot of shonen. Like during the dreaming, it being a very feminine kind of story, it kind of I ended up tapping into aspects of myself that I didn't really consider before. I guess I was that kind of girl who didn't like Pink and liked much, Jackie Chan action movies. I mean, I was that kind of girl. And growing up, I always kind of was like not into the overly feminine thing. And being a horror and mystery and thriller fan didn't help as well. I think women get a lot more judgment if you like that sort of thing, because I like true crime as well. Like you'll be surprised at the number of women who are horror, thriller, true crime fans. The majority of these genre readers tend to be women. But I think growing up, being into that sort of things, people judge you quite a fair bit for it, in that they make value judgments on your character. It's like, why are you into that kind of, creepy stuff? I mean, you're weird, and it can be hard on someone growing up. But working on the dreaming and having so many people like it, because it did speak to a particular kind of teenage girl, particularly the kind of teenage girl I was growing up, in that I wanted to read spooky stuff, but either couldn't find stuff that appealed to me, or was just too gory, which I didn't like. And so I think it spoke to a particular subset of teen girls who liked that sort of thing and kind of made it kind of okay.
You have mentioned that you made changes and updates for the dreaming, some of which was adding on new content. But what made you decide that you wanted to have a new, updated, revised, extended edition and make those changes?
Well, the original dreaming, I might as well be upfront about it, had some issues with cultural appropriation. And this is interesting because it also had one of the first representations of Australian Aboriginal people in it. And it was a teacher, Miss Anu. And so I'll talk a little bit about Miss Anu because a lot of people didn't know she was Aboriginal in America. I've actually had some, because this is way back in 2005. Miss Anu appears in the first volume as a teacher at the school. She's a physics teacher. I deliberately made her a physics teacher because I think when it comes to representations of First Nations people in Australian pop culture and in Australian film and things like that, they tend to lean heavily on the traditional kinds of aspects of Aboriginal culture, which is great. It's good to see that representation. But it also means that average, everyday Aboriginal people working a job in the city Like they kind of, get glossed over for, to show the more the kind of the more traditional Aboriginal culture. And is this a bad thing? I don't think so. And I thought to myself, there is no way I'm going to depict an Aboriginal person, in the traditional way. It doesn't make sense within the context of the school. So obviously I made her a physics teacher because that is it kind of pushes back against some stereotypes that people have about dark-skinned people. Let me just say, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So I just thought as a Aboriginal teacher, she's young, she's a kind of rational person who believes in the power of science, and she's not into that supernatural stuff. And so that makes her an interesting character in this supernatural thriller, in that she resists, whatever supernatural crap is going on at the school, and she's like, and I think that's very important to depict, African American or Black characters, Aboriginal characters as people, who, isn't as mystical as white people sometimes, white culture likes to paint them. So 2005, which is very unusual, like manga these days don't have many dark-skinned characters. There's a lot more of them now. But back in 2005, this is something a lot of people haven't seen. And I got some fan mail from teenagers in America who told me that this is the first time they've actually seen a Black character in a manga, and they're like, oh, I'm so excited, I've never seen anything like this before, blah blah blah. And so this is like for some people it really blew their minds, because they did not realize they would see a Black person in a manga, and it was not I didn't make a token aspect of her darkness. Like, nobody cared. Like, she's she's got dark skin, that's it. She's, to the other characters, she's a teacher and not a kind of awkward Black girl thing. So she's being a kind of a nerdy kind of person. She's not great with the students, she's not the fun teacher. So a lot of the teachers don't like her because she's very strict as a teacher, and kind of demands respect from her students. And so as a character, it blew people's minds. So she's like, the fact that she's Aboriginal is not really a factor in the story. So that remains completely unchanged in the revised edition. She was always just a physics teacher who happened to be Aboriginal. So it was interesting to me that it got that kind of reaction, and of course, I'm glad I put her in it. And but I do find it interesting that I had to explain to some of these African American kids that I'm sorry, she's Aboriginal, which is not the same thing as African American. Because I felt bad about it, because they clearly thought she was African American, and I had to tell them that she's not, because you can't say that just because one group of people have dark skin and another group of people have dark skin, they're the same thing. It's not an equivalent. So I had to tell them that, and I kind of felt bad. And it kind of was a good thing for Aboriginal kids growing up here as well, because I did come across people at conventions who told me, it's like, oh, this is the first time I saw an Aboriginal character in a manga, and blah blah, it was a big deal. And I actually told them that there were other elements of Aboriginal cultural appropriation near the end of the story in volume 2 and 3, mostly in volume 3 actually. And they said, well, I didn't, they told me they didn't mind. They were just so grateful that there was a depiction of an Aboriginal person, and didn't make a point of their, Aboriginalness or their, mystical Aboriginal things. So so apparently Aboriginal people don't mind as much, but the truth is that, it is not a good thing for modern audiences, and it was not supposed to be the actual ending for the story. What happened with the original story was that Tokyo Pop told me there was no more volumes. It's just 3 volumes for the Dreaming, and I had planned the story for longer. And the Lovecraftian elements had to be removed and kind of replaced with something for that reason. Is like the beginning of volume 2 made a reference to one of Lovecraft's most famous quotes from the Necronomicon, that which is not dead may eternal lie, and in strange eons even death may die. I think all Lovecraft fans know that quote. And that Lennis ended it up in volume 2 and stayed there for the original release, but the rest of the Lovecraftian references were kind of removed because I had to end it at volume 3. And so now that the writer left Tokyo Pop, it's like, oh great, I could finally get rid of the inappropriate stuff with the Aboriginal culture and just replace it with something that's full on Lovecraftian, and move back to my original plan for the series, and continue leaving the Miss Anu and her role in it completely fine, because originally she was meant to be representation, and not as a token character that represents a background, but just just here's a physics teacher who just happens to be Aboriginal. I think people value that kind of representation, and the fact that the girls were Eurasian as well. This is not something that people can pick up off just by looking at it, but judging from Amber's hairstyle, it's a very stereotypical Asian hairstyle, and people did not get that. And I was like, okay, whatever, but that hint is there if they were looking. And the girls in book 2 also mentioned that their father's from Hong Kong now. Originally, it was from Singapore. I've changed it to Hong Kong since I'm from Hong Kong, so it's a bit more authentic that way, I feel.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's why the changes were made. That it wasn't supposed to be like that anyway, and I'm glad I finally, am able to put out this new version that was probably closer to the original vision that I had for the series.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
Okay.
apart from the updated for modern audiences thing, which is true as well, there's one way you can put it, but it was not really something I wanted to do to begin with the original series.
Culture influenced the writing. How about locations?
Okay,
How did
so
locations influence this series?
yes, I had an excuse to draw the Sydney Harbour Bridge, into the first panel. And again,
Yeah.
some Americans did not realize what it was. I think the Sydney Harbour Bridge is pretty famous, but probably not in America so much.
Nope.
It is a
It's just the Opera House. Sorry.
yeah. Okay, I discovered that when I got found out from America, and people thought, which part of America is this set in? And it's like, it's set in Sydney. Yeah, but anyway, in the story is set in the New South Wales bushlands. And this is interesting to talk about because this side story is actually set up north, near the Daintree forest. So I'll just say it's in the Daintree forest. And so it's a contrast between the more temperate kind of New South Wales bushlands where bushfires occur, while the side story is set up north in a more subtropical kind of Daintree rainforest kind of setting. And so it's a lot more humid. It feels very different. It's black and white artwork or grayscale artwork in the original The Dreaming. So you can't really tell, but the way that eucalyptus forests look in New South Wales is that the colors are very different. Because I'm not really a camping person, but in high school, everybody was forced to go camping, and I did my fair share of orienteering and kind of a sleeping out in tents in the bush. And it always struck me at how the colors tend to be more greenish, bluish, and whitish because of the trunks of the eucalyptus in the areas that we ended up camping in. And the reddish bark falling off everywhere is just a feature of eucalyptus forests. And because it's an evergreen country, it's like never changes. And so that was one thing about the Australian bush, in that you don't get the 4 seasons here. It's just bush all the time, 365 days a year until it's bushfire season. In fact, one of the mistakes I made drawing the bush in the original The Dreaming was that I gave some of the eucalyptus trees blackened trunks. And at the time, I actually didn't know why the trunks were black, because I came across a lot of these kind of eucalyptus when I was camping that had black trunks on the bottom of it. So the top of the tree would be fine, the bottom half would be completely blackened. And I thought that was normal. It's like how trees grow. Right. Years later, after I did The Dreaming, and because I actually drew that in The Dreaming as well, I found out it's because it was bushfires. When a bushfire's been through an area, the trees get blackened tree trunk, which is necessary as part of Australian fauna. They flora and fauna, they need the bushfire to crack open the seeds. A lot of trees can't grow without and a lot of the flora can't grow without those bushfires. And so unfortunately I added that in The Dreaming, even though it was supposed to be an area that doesn't see much bushfire. And so it's like it didn't make sense actually. That shouldn't have been in there, but now I know. But I added those blackened trunks because I thought that was normal. It's like, ouch, should have done my research. But once you go further up north and go into a more subtropical kind of weather, and which is not far north, like if you go to Cairns, that's full on tropical, and then it gets very steamy, very jungle-like. It's a very different kind of environment. If you go subtropical, it's a mix between the temperate and the tropical. That's where the sequel to the side story to The Dreaming is set, in the Daintree forest. And the colors get greener and more vibrant, a lot more mossy. There's a lot more. It gets misty, and the tree trunks have a different color. And so I thought that because I went there for Queensland for some kind of writers' workshop and kind of hung out with that kind of environment, and I felt it's always very magical, but a different kind of magical because it's so much wetter and more humid, but not so hot as it would be further up north. And so that difference in how you depict that kind of more humid feeling, more wet, more green, more vibrant, and all that, more ferns everywhere. Ferns is not something you probably would see in a temperate kind of a New South Wales environment. So being able to draw that for the side story was really fascinating. because I had to think, and I'm going to a research trip there, so at least that I get some nice photos, I guess. It's the side story right now is set around the Byron Bay area, so just south of the Queensland border, but it doesn't really matter exactly where. It is close to Nightcap National Park, so being able to depict the flora and fauna over there is going to be interesting. Yeah, because it's so different and compared to the temperate bush. So that's something that I guess is something that Australians understand. That probably people from other countries won't grasp as much because it requires you to have some kind of understanding of the different kinds of landscape in Australia. And a lot of people don't even know that Australia has rainforests, and different kinds of rainforests too. To them, it's all the outback. And I've been to the outback. It's unique, but definitely not the kind of environment that I'm drawing about, I guess. Yeah, so the landscape does play a great deal into the kind of story the side story is, because people don't really disappear in rainforests. Like I'm sure they do, but the national mythos is around the bush, which is nearly always New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, those kind of places, not really in Queensland. Yeah, where people see as a kind of like a kind of a very different kind of vibe to it. Even though I'm sure a lot of people go missing in the in the Dangerous Forest too. Yeah, so because of that, the story is very different. It's kind of like a psychological horror romance story.
Oh.
And because it is kind of romantic, when I went to the Daintree rainforest, it has that kind of mystical, magical vibe that I don't really get in the more temperate regions of New South Wales. So I thought, oh, lush, it would be nice to have a romance story here that's a little bit dark. So it kind of genders a very different kind of a creative response, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I really thought of different things when I was in that environment compared to here in the more temperate bushlands.
What else have you been up to since The Dreaming first came out?
I did the nonfiction series of biographies about famous queens. They're about 30-something pages each, and they're all really footnoted and well-researched, and footnotes are online and stuff like that. So one of them was for a master's degree as well. So I'm kind of doing a bit of stuff with universities as well.
Okay.
So that's, anyway, for the Queen series, that's called Women Who Are Kings. And these, they're distributed by Scholastic and Lamont. They're kind of, aimed at a year 7 to 8 audience, I suppose. But I've seen kids much younger read them. So I guess it's based on what people are interested in. And being at Queen's, I'm a big history buff, and I like to talk about the history of famous women and political women in particular, because women, very often people think that women aren't interested in politics, economics, all that serious stuff that, only men are interested in. And I find that really annoying because absolutely there's lots of women who are economists, who are politicians, who make great strides in their country, in the world. And I'm like, give some of these women some attention and give them the proper respect as politicians that they deserve, because I have noticed a lot of TV series and movies when they talk about famous political women, Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, there's heaps more, they focus on their romantic life. And it's like, that is the least interesting thing about these women. Yeah, it's so like, come on, man. It's like you can talk about Queen Elizabeth and all you can talk about is who she was into romantically. It's like, this woman did a lot of stuff, please. Yeah, and she kind of operated in very complicated political space as well, because England, they're not kind to their queens. Women make their mark on it, but she had to struggle and take on a position that she never really wanted to, and I think she did a fine job. And Catherine the Great even more so, because it shows you the cultural differences between Russia and England when it comes to women running the show. And Catherine wasn't even Russian, but she, people would say her soul is Russian. You would say that to a Russian person, they'll be like, yeah, she's German, but her soul is Russian. She was more Russian than most Russians. Yeah, so Catherine had a very different life. And so it's interesting to compare. And Wu Zetian, the only female emperor of China, she had a fascinating life. And so doing those stories, apart from talking about the way that these women ruled and how they just never hid their gender, they ran with it. And they, tailored their propaganda, to suit the fact that they are a woman, and nobody had a problem with it. So the question, can women run a country? Well, they've been doing it for a very long time across the world and across different time periods. Yeah, so it was great writing that series. Yeah, so I just
still
finished.
Remember him. Sorry.
No, it's fine. So I just finished Catherine the Great, and the next one that I hope to work on is an African queen. I'm probably
Okay.
butchering her name, but her name's Njingas, and she's a ruler of modern day Angola back when it was called Matamba and Dongo, I think, or Nongo. And so her story is a fascinating one because she fought the Portuguese.
Okay.
And yeah, that was in the 16th or 17th century. And so she was a warrior queen as well. So her story is quite fascinating. Not entirely a happy one, but it shows you like because Africa has an overabundance of queens for whatever reason. There's a kind of culture with a lot of matrilineal at the very least kind of kingdoms and queendoms. Yeah, so being able to do an African queen alongside some of the more distinguished queens is fantastic. But right now, I'm focusing on, the side stories of the dreaming. So that's kind of, a lot of research. It's not easy to research this queen. Is inching along, but I hope to get that out because there is everybody knows Elizabeth, Catherine the
Hmm.
Great, Hatshepsut, like Wu Zetian is lesser known. By Chinese, every Chinese person knows about her. Lesser known by other people, but it's good to
Hmm.
see queens that are lesser known and being brought to the
Yeah.
forefront.
And, since your name is Queenie, it's kind of required.
Yeah, pretty much.
And I mean, I particularly like that you call the series Women Who Were Kings because I'm a woman who's a king, technically.
Yeah,
So,
that's true. That's true. Actually, come to think of
yep.
it. Yeah, yeah.
Do you have anything else in the works that you
Mhm.
can tell us about? Any more collaborations or other solo works or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I've been because a lot of my other work is several things. A lot of my other work is illustration work. So I work for School
Yeah.
Magazine doing illustrations for them, which I
Okay.
really enjoy because it is I get to read a lot of short stories. Like I like Kit Lit. What can I say? It's right in
Yeah.
the I my work's for teens, so YA, mostly PG
Hmm.
13. But I could always go younger and tailor my art style to fit that kind of age group. And I really love
Hmm.
drawing on, all the different kind of stories you get in School Magazine. It's from the Department of
Nice.
Education, and they have comics as well, so that's very exciting. It's
Cool.
good to see schools having more comics, and so I also sometimes am commissioned to do short comic stories for middle grade audiences, things like that.
Cool.
So that's been fantastic as well. That allows
Nice.
me to write short stories for a young audience, like 6 pages to 8 pages. I think that's a very good length and all that. So I also am working on a PhD. Yeah, so
Oh,
that's close
wow.
to being finished. So that's sees me working on a comic kind of game hybrid. So it's me. Previously, it was comics prose. Now it's comics games. So I'm using Unity to build a game engine that is basically a comic strip. And so that particular PhD addresses neoliberalism, capitalism, and the problems of creative labor in a kind of globalized digital world.
I
In that,
volunteer as the tester.
yeah, I'll, I'll send you the game build later on. Yeah,
Ooh,
so
fun.
it's close to being finished.
Cool.
And I'm currently writing the conclusion for my thesis, and
Okay.
that's very interesting. And it's kind of pretty heavy-handed in what it's talking about. But then my PhD would argue that the context in which I'm creating is very important. As I mentioned earlier, comics as a medium is very labor intensive.
Mm.
And being in Australia, it's really, really hard to commission a comic because it's expensive to do so. And
Mm.
so this actually uses a game engine. Of course, the art still has to be done. It's
Yeah.
but I'm kind of publicly releasing all the code as part of my PhD, and I'll
Huh.
explain why I'm
Okay.
doing that. And I'm making a Creative Commons, just to put this thing out there that anybody who wants to build something similar can use the code that I have to build on top of it and
Nice.
expand on it if they want. And part of it is because my thesis on capitalism talks about the digital commons, and in that
Mm.
things should be in the public domain, and rather than kind of all walled off in copyrights and patents and all that, to allow people to remix if they want. So there's a
Yeah.
bit of an argument for that, in particular when you consider that digital comics these days is largely defined by webtoons. And I have my own issues with webtoons because they have not been particularly favorable when it comes to labor rights and what they're paying creators. And so that is my
Yeah.
big problem with webtoons, and I mentioned that
Mm.
in my PhD. But if webtoons is the only game in town, how can creators protect themselves, what can they do. And part of what my thesis is about working in the context of a PhD, which while not outside capitalism, universities allow you more freedom in that you don't have to worry whether this is commercially viable or not. So part of my PhD is about that, and that's what I'm working on. So frequently, in this day and age, I think a lot of creators, whether you do comics or manga, struggle with the money issue. Is like, how can I continue my passion when you have so many factors that are kind of contributing to the difficulty of working full time in comics? You know, there's a demand for it, but it's being met by things from overseas, and so that's why, you know, the Australian angle again is so important, because otherwise, with a smaller audience, there's a danger of Australian voices just disappearing, you know, amidst all the international voices that are better funded and all that out there.
I feel like that's the case for any minority, cultural, linguistic, whatever, and our world would definitely be less vibrant if it was all mainstream voices. Well, speaking of that kind of diversity, in the last few years, we have seen an explosion of graphic novels, manga, etc., by new Australian creators from very diverse backgrounds, like Remy Lai and Rachel Ong and Safdar Ahmed, and there are also creators working in very diverse styles and genres. From your perspective, how do you see the Australian graphic novel, comic, manga community changing? And what do you think of where we're at now, and where do you think we'll be in the future?
I think it'll continue to grow. And in particular, I'm very grateful for the diverse voices that has popped up. And most of the people that you've mentioned are doing things that are quite different to what I'm doing. Like my work is mostly YA. It's kind of a pretty genre. Like I said, it's mystery thriller and it's horror. That's not saying I can't add kind of more literary elements to it. That's up to interpretation. But the truth is that there's a room for everybody doing all sorts of diverse things. And of course, I'm a manga style artist as well, so that kind of puts me in a different category as well. But I think that more of this, it can only be a good thing for the younger generation who wants to grow up and draw comics or manga, whatever it is that you want to do. It kind of shows you that there are opportunities out there. And particularly what I do as well, in that when it comes to writing and drawing, is that there are many areas in which you can apply your skills in. And I guess having these kinds of creators being supported locally show you that at least comics is getting a little bit more of the respect that they really deserve. And that these, particularly in the literary sphere, that it's being recognized as something of value. So I think that will continue to change. Again, I hope to see more of these kind of creators working in a, in the kid space. You know, Remy already does that, so that's not blowing anyone's minds when I mention her. But it's just that a lot of the time it's just cheaper for publishers to bring in international work. You know, there's just fewer opportunities for Australian creators compared to those that are international. And, even locally trying to get the word out, about your works. It's tough because libraries themselves are changing these days. This is something that you understand perfectly, in that even though libraries are incredibly important to any community, the system has changed considerably in the past 5 years. And so librarians are being bounced around between libraries and things like that. And while they want to get some more community events happening, it's hard when people are constantly being swapped from library to library, and then this library belongs to this, council, and then this and that, and restructuring and all that. So hopefully things have settled down a bit. But it's always hard to get the word out with libraries, even though library comic events usually tend to be quite popular. And that's exactly the sort of thing that you want to see more of, in patrons coming to the library and enjoying the events and all the arts and crafts and creative stuff that you could do at libraries, apart from all the reading you can do and things like that. Yeah, so hopefully Australian librarians can be interested in supporting Australian creators more when it comes to graphic novels and comics, and kind of highlight them more, because people do notice when you put out Australian works. And that, so at the end of the day, as wonderful as it is to have more kind of diverse creators in the Australian sphere, what we always struggle with is distribution and marketing, and letting people know that we're there. Because got no budget, you know. Even if you do
Yeah.
have a budget, it's hard to reach people, and it's just much easier for much larger overseas companies to do their marketing here
Hmm.
versus us trying to do marketing. As usual, word of mouth really helps a lot, you know. So I'll try to get some of that going. But at the end of the day, it's a struggle being a creator in this country. Yeah. So while I'm all for more creators, yeah, it's like it would be nice if there was more opportunities for them.
Hopefully, librarians can continue to be a force for good and
Mhm.
help promote these Australian creative voices.
Yeah,
Fingers
yeah.
crossed.
Yes, I find that the Australian government can always do more because I feel the New Zealand government is doing quite a bit. I spoke
Okay.
to a New Zealand comics creator. He was talking about how the New Zealand state library sends him on tours to schools around New Zealand, all
Cool.
expenses paid, to talk about
Yeah.
his work as a New Zealand creator,
Nice.
creating New Zealand works and all that, and about himself and what he does and all that. And it's like, do I see the state library, of Australia, they're doing something like that? It's like, come on, guys, you could do more to
Well,
promote.
state, the problem being Australia is much bigger. I
Mm,
think the various state libraries are doing some things. Like State Library Victoria, I'm based in
mm.
Melbourne, so Victoria, has a um, author or writers boot camp that is, I think it might be Remy Lai is the person that is the creator that's leading it, and it
Mhm.
was completely booked out.
Of course, there's demand
So,
for it. But
hmm
I understand why there's, State Library of Victoria would do something like that. The State Library of Western Australia also has the Perth Comic Arts Festival. So there are people doing things in various states. Yeah, but it would be nice if they had something a bit more official.
All right, so but let's end this on a positive note. So at the end of these creator chats, we like to ask for 2 or 3 comics or graphic novels you'd like to recommend. It can be something you read recently, something that was an inspiration or influence for the dreaming, or just some of your all-time favorites.
Mhm. For me, I read a lot of old school shoujo.
Mm,
Particularly the works of Hagiomoto. So I'll mention her work. I'll bring up
okay.
female authors because even as a manga reader, I think that they're so different to the men when they write.
Yeah.
And so
Hmm.
Hagiomoto, she's one of what they call the Fabulous 49ers, which is a kind of a pioneering group of women who worked in teen girl oriented works back in the
Okay.
70s. And so Hagiomoto did a series called The Poe Family. So she does dark psychological works that is, I don't know whether it's translated into English, unfortunately. Yeah, so Hagiomoto, so
Okay.
Hagiomото. So she does dark psychological works that are not as commonly seen in shoujo anymore. So the Poe family is a story about a family of vampires, and the lead is called Edgar. And so Edgar Allan Poe. That's a straight up kind of connection between that. So that story had a kind of influence on some of the characters in the side story for the dreaming. Yeah, and
Okay.
you would, if you saw it, you would know exactly what I mean. Yeah, so I really like Hagiomoto's paneling. I think her style of paneling, because of the subject matter that she writes, is always way more interesting than the panel thing that they do
Yeah.
in kind of more conventional kind of
Hmm.
shonen manga for the dudes. And so I always appreciate the way that her paneling works. And it's something that I try to kind of tap into for, the side story of the dreaming that I'm currently working on. But we shall see about that. So Hagiomoto is not very well known in the West, so hopefully she is
Mm.
better known. There's another manga that I read recently that I think is really interesting in that it is
Mm.
again a dark supernatural psychological horror story, and it's really scary. Yeah, to be honest, but in a not in a gory way, but in a psychological way. So it's
Okay.
called I think I want to hug Aono-kun so hard that I could die or something. Yeah, I'll see if I can like that is available in English. So it's a story about a teenage girl who falls very, very deeply in love with a guy. And so they're quite young and they started going out for 2 weeks and then he dies. and comes back as a ghost. And so
Huh.
she's
Okay.
sorry about my ghost boyfriend, and you think that it's very wholesome and cute,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not really, and it's kind of leans into the same kind of strange, scary, supernatural fear of the unknown that we have, and that our culture has certain ideas about what ghosts are like. Casper, Casper the
Mm-hmm.
friendly ghost, and this story
Yeah.
is not like that. You think that this guy is a friendly ghost, but what actually are ghosts? What actually is he? And the story gets very, very creepy because apparently you can invite this dude into your body, and that's something that
Okay.
the girl does accidentally. And
Huh.
some very strange things happen from then onwards. But what I love about the story is that it is actually not listed as shoujo, but I think the subject matter actually counts. But
Hmm.
it captures really well the difficulty that teenage girls have in managing this extremely strong emotions when it comes to love, but also when it comes to grief. And like this
Hmm.
girl, she's a very awkward girl to begin with. She was elated to have a boyfriend, and then he dies so suddenly. And there's a kind of whole mystery behind, his death and his family and how this whole thing came about. And it is a very good look at the inability to let go when it comes to things like grief, which is horror is actually something that talks about that a lot. And the way they depicts, the way that she kind of latches onto this guy's ghost, despite the
Hmm.
dangers, is like I think it's a very good depiction of the kind of obsessions that teenage girls can have, and kind of treats it in a respectful manner. Like she can
Yeah.
be quite annoying at times, but that's part of growing up. Like teenagers do dumb
Mm-hmm.
things, can I say? So a very
Yeah.
different kind of story to the Poe family, which in vampires are
Definitely. Yeah.
immortals, but targeted at the same audience. So it's another example of what
Okay.
I think is what I like to call dark shoujo, which is
Okay.
kind of a stories aimed at teenage girls but have darker impulses, and is not the typical kind of cutesy romance sort of thing that you might associate teenage girls into liking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another that I like is a josei, so it's targeted at an older audience,
Okay. Yeah.
and it's called Don't Call It Mystery. So these are mystery stories, and
Ah, yeah. I
I
think I
love
have
that
heard
series.
of that one.
Yeah, because the thing is, it is based on the main character, who the detective fellow is based on Kindaiichi. So I read a number of Japanese detective novels. So Kindaiichi
Yeah.
is a very famous Japanese detective not series of novels written by, I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember who it was, but it's a 70s kind of author. And
Yeah.
this kind of series makes some references to Kindaiichi in Japan, like super popular with their detective novels and all that.
Yeah.
So Don't Call It Mystery has elements of that. So it's straightforward mystery stories. So not really murder mysteries, but more like in the tradition of kind of Sherlock Holmes, in that sometimes there is just a mystery, you're trying to figure something out, what's going
Mm-hmm.
on, and all that. So I really enjoy Don't Call It Mystery. Yeah, that story. So that's very popular in Japan. It is not as popular in the US, which is a bummer because I love mystery stories. Come on. Yeah, so I really
I
like that because
It could be that it hasn't really been out that terribly long. I mean, the first volume didn't come out in English until end of May last year,
yeah, I'm
it looks
afraid that when it
like.
comes to the anime fan community, they go for the hype shonen stuff. And so
Mm,
kinds of stories that are well written, like that are quieter, tends to kind of fly under the radar. So Don't Call
yeah.
It Mystery. It has a series of it's just great mystery stories. And a lot of it's very Japanese as well. So if you read it and you have no
Okay.
context in Japanese culture, particularly the
Mm-hmm.
language, you might struggle a bit because the author makes a lot of references to Japanese language and culture when they kind of solve these mysteries. So it can be a bit of a problem, you know, for readers who are not, who don't have that kind of background. In your case, I think you
Mm,
really enjoy it. It is aimed at a female audience after all. Like all the stuff that I mentioned
yeah.
are really good works, and they're all aimed at female audiences. Even though only one of them is tagged as something for teenage girls, which is too bad, because a lot of the time it's down to marketing and
Yeah.
not really much else. Like I want to hold Aonokun so tightly that I could die. Yeah, that one, for example, is
Yeah.
I think it's a seinen series aimed at older men, older like kind of 18 to 25-year-old men. And I'm like, this
Yep.
story
Yep.
can be aimed at anybody because good stories can be read by anybody,
Yeah.
right? So
Wikipedia claims that it's a seinen. Yeah.
yes, it is. It probably is because the art is not typical shoujo art, but what it's
Mm,
about, I think, is absolutely something that teen girls can get into. But that's the thing with the Japanese industry, in that they have certain ideas of what can or cannot be labeled shoujo, and a lot of the time it's not so much who's reading it. It is like more of a marketing thing. And
mm,
it's too bad. Like all the kind of stories that I just mentioned are, darker stories that I think,
mm.
anyone can enjoy and do just happen to appeal more to a female audience, I think.
But also some of this stuff is more marketed towards the guys hoping to find a girlfriend like this versus the girls that might be going through this kind of experience themselves.
Exactly. But I think a lot of these kind of just slip through the cracks as well, in that
Yeah.
yeah, like Don't Call It Mystery, that's definitely a female audience in Japan at the very least.
Okay.
O Family, that's straight up, I think it's JoJo, but a lot of critics like it too because Hagio she's a critical darling, so people just love it. Yeah,
Mm,
and that kind of stuff isn't done very much in shoujo anymore, which is to the detriment of shoujo as a kind of category and genre. Yeah.
hmm. It looks like sometimes it's translated as the Poe clan in
Yes.
English
Mm-hmm.
and not the Poe family, depending on where you're looking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Ah, fun.
Yeah, it's kind of like women, I think, bring an interesting vibe to horror that is much more
Yeah.
empathetic than men does. For example, while we're on the subject of vampires, I loved Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. It's a very different take on vampirism, and it's
Hmm.
not it doesn't make them look fun, but it asks you to sympathize with the monsters, and that's a tradition that goes right back to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. In that
Hmm.
women bring a very different kind of vibe and approach to dark subject matter that
Yeah.
the male authors approach very differently. Not saying that it's that big, but it is definitely something that people read and readers pick up on. And so we're seeing this kind of work is because I work in that sphere as well, dark
Hmm.
psychological mysteries and stuff like that. It's what I like.
Yeah.
So it's so gratifying to see other female creators get attention for doing something similar because horror as a genre is something that has a big fan base, but also elicits a very strong reaction from many people. And people who hate it really hate it, even as they're not that well educated on what it is.
Hmm.
So there's that problem with horror as a genre. But
Yeah.
if you ask me, a lot of women are into horror. They just don't know that what they're reading or watching is actually just horror.
Makes sense to me. Well, hopefully you can maybe do some graphical adaptations of some of these lovely dark shoujo-y kind of storylines from a Western author. That would be fun.
Yeah, that would be interesting. In terms of
Like Interview
Interview
with
with
a
the
Vampire.
yeah, there's already graphic novel
Okay.
adaptations and stuff
Oh,
like
right.
that.
Yeah.
Something like the thing is, I'm not a fan of the Haunting on Hill House. Shirley
Mm,
Jackson. I'm not really a fan of hers, but
yeah.
her work I think would be very interesting if adapted because she is the Haunting of Hill House is basically an exercise in an unreliable narrator. So how would that work out in manga or graphic novels? It's like who knows?
Yeah.
That would be really interesting. There's been movie adaptations of it, so that would be cool. Yeah, but apart from that, there's a lot of female horror writers as well, but nobody that I really kind of latched into. Like the genres, I think the genre is poised to make a comeback, but I think that like like apart from the Stephen King, Clive Barkers in the horror genre, there aren't there are some very well-known women in it, but not even so much in the stuff that I was inspired by. Oh, Rebecca, for example. The Dreaming was actually very much inspired by Rebecca as well, by Daphne du Maurier. And I think that Rebecca, it's a gothic kind of thriller. It's a psychological horror story. Weirdly enough,
Hmm.
Daphne du Maurier cops a lot of black because I don't know what it is about female authors that people tend to think of them as romance authors. And
Yep.
dear God, and I've heard Rebecca
Hmm.
being described as a romantic thriller, and it's like, no, this is not a romance. There's no romance in it. There's nothing romantic about this woman's life.
Well, thank you. It was lovely chatting with you.
No, thank you. It was a great chat. Yeah, thanks very much for having me, and for Alia Group as well.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to finish off, I'll just let people know that The Dreaming's available already, and the book 2 and 3 is coming out soon as well. So I'll just let Alia Group know when it's available for librarians and whoever who wants to get a copy. Yeah,
Awesome.
so that can be ordered through library suppliers. They'll be able to find it in the network.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.